The town of Redrock Flats didn't welcome strangers. It tolerated them the way a dying man tolerates flies, aware of their presence, too exhausted to swat them away, certain they meant nothing good. It was 1873, and the Nevada desert had been baking the town into the color of old bone for 30 years. The railroad had promised salvation, laid half its tracks, then changed its route and left Redrock Flats with nothing but broken promises, and a population too stubborn or too broke to leave. What remained was a single main street of warped timber buildings, a livery stable that smelled of rot, a church nobody used, and the Silver Spur Saloon, which everybody did. The rider came in from the south just past noon. He rode a dark brown quarter horse that moved with the calm efficiency of an animal that had covered serious ground and expected to cover more. The man in the saddle matched the horse in temperament. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean without being thin, with a face that had been weathered by sun and silence into something unreadable. His hat was the color of old charcoal. His coat was trail dusty. He wore one pistol on his right hip, carried low and unhurried, the way a man carries a tool rather than a trophy. He didn't look at the town like a man looking for trouble. He looked at it the way a man looks at weather, taking accurate measure, making no judgment, preparing accordingly. His name was Colt Raines. He had been other things in other years, a deputy, a marshal, a man with a home and a reason to return to it. Those years were behind him now, folded away like a letter too painful to reread but impossible to throw out. Now he was simply a drifter. He moved through towns like water moves through sand, present, then gone, leaving little trace. He stabled his horse, paid the boy in coin without being asked, and walked to the Silver Spur. The saloon was busy for midday. It smelled of sawdust, spilled whiskey, and the particular sourness of men who worked hard in the heat and bathed rarely. Card games occupied 3 tables. A piano player worked through a tune with 2 broken keys with the resignation of a man who had long since stopped noticing. Along the bar, Deputy Hank Greer held court, a broad, soft man wearing a badge the way a scarecrow wears a coat, more decoration than substance. He laughed too loudly at his own remarks and watched the room with small, proprietary eyes. Raines took a table near the wall, back to the corner, and asked for water and whatever was hot. That was when he first saw Helma Voss. She moved through the crowded room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, weaving between tables carrying a tray stacked improbably high. Her dark hair pinned back from a face that was striking not merely for its features, but for the particular kind of dignity it held onto despite every effort the room made to strip it away. She was 27 years old and looked both younger and older than that simultaneously, younger in the quickness of her eyes, older in the set of her jaw. She worked with the relentlessness of someone who had no alternative, sunup to sundown. Tables, floors, ledgers, errands, whatever Silas Drummond required, whenever he required it. Silas Drummond was easy to identify. He stood behind the bar like a man who had long confused his property with his kingdom. He was heavy through the middle and wore his success in the gold chain across his vest, and the way he surveyed the room, not as a host surveys guests, but as an owner surveys livestock. He had the kind of face that had probably once been merely unpleasant and had, over years of unchecked cruelty, graduated into something uglier. Raines was halfway through his water when it happened. Helma's tray caught the edge of a chair. A patron had shifted it without warning, carelessly, the way men shift things they don't own. 2 glasses slid off and shattered on the floorboards. Not her fault. Obvious to anyone who was watching honestly. Silas moved from behind the bar with the speed of a man who had been waiting for an excuse. 2 glasses, he said, loud enough for the whole room. Do you know what 2 glasses cost? He stood over her as she crouched to gather the pieces, his voice filling the saloon the way smoke fills a room slowly, completely, leaving nowhere clean to breathe. "You'll have it taken from your wages, both glasses and my patience." The room went quiet in the practiced way of people who had learned that looking up cost more than looking down. The piano player slowed, then stopped. Cards were studied with sudden intense interest. Helma did not look up. She gathered the glass in her bare hands carefully so as not to cut herself and said, "Yes, Mr. Drummond," in a voice that revealed nothing. Not fear, not anger, nothing he could use. Raines watched all of this. He noticed the bruise on her right wrist, half hidden by her sleeve. He noticed the way her hands were steady even when they shouldn't have been. He noticed that she was the only person in the room who hadn't flinched at the sound of Silas's voice. He drank his water. He said nothing. He did not look away. The afternoon wore into early evening. Raines remained at his table longer than a man who only wanted water needed to. He told himself it was the food, which was plain but filling. He did not examine the other reason too closely. Helma brought him a second cup without being asked, and with it, an extra portion of cornbread that hadn't been on his order. She set it down without meeting his eyes and turned to leave. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. She paused. Looked at him then directly, measuring the way intelligent people look at things they aren't sure about yet. "You didn't make a show of watching," she said. "Most men make a show of it." Then she walked away. He ate the cornbread. It was the best thing he'd tasted in 6 weeks. Later, when the saloon had thinned and the lamps had burned lower, Raines stepped outside for air. He moved around the side of the building through instinct, old lawman's habit, always check the perimeter, and heard it before he saw it. 2 of Silas's men had Helma cornered against the back wall, not robbing her, something worse. She had her back straight and her chin up and her eyes burning, and she was not making a sound because she had clearly learned that sounds brought no help in Redrock Flats. Raines stepped out of the shadow and stood between them. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, still as stone, and looked at the 2 men with an expression that communicated with perfect, quiet clarity that he had seen considerably worse than them and had not been impressed by any of it. They left, quickly, without a word. Helma exhaled once, controlled it, and looked at him. "I didn't ask for help." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." She studied him another moment, then walked back inside. He stood in the dark for a while after that. He had planned to ride out by first light. He was good at riding out. He had been doing it for years. He was still thinking about riding out when Silas Drummond, informed by his men before the night was over, decided that the quiet stranger at the corner table had become a problem that required solving. By dawn, Deputy Greer and 3 armed men were waiting at the stable. Raines walked in from the street, saw them arranged there among the horses and hay bales, and stopped. He took a breath of morning air, cool and clean and smelling faintly of sage from the desert beyond town. He looked at Greer. He looked at the saloon, where a curtain moved at the upper window, Helma, watching. He looked back at Greer. "Ride on," Greer said. "Mr. Drummond's generosity doesn't extend to men who interfere in his business. You've got till sunrise, which was about 5 minutes ago." Raines considered this. He looked at the horse. He looked at the road south, which he knew, and at the curtain, which had gone still. "I'll be gone by noon," he said, his voice carrying no heat whatsoever. "But the girl comes with me." He let that sit for 1 breath, then 2, "unless one of you wants to die first." Greer laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had never once been made to account for himself, loud, dismissive, the laugh of borrowed courage. He reached for his pistol with the casual confidence of someone who had drawn on unarmed storekeepers and frightened women and called it authority. He never cleared the holster. Raines moved with the economy of a man who had learned long ago that speed without precision was just noise. 1 step forward, one hand redirecting Greer's wrist outward, the pistol taken cleanly and deposited in the hay at the deputy's feet before the laugh had fully left his mouth. Greer stood there with an empty hand, and a face cycling rapidly through confusion, humiliation, and fear. The three men behind him recalculated. "I'd go home," Raines said to all of them, returning to his original position as though nothing of particular interest had occurred. "Sleep it off. Tell Drummond whatever you need to tell him." They went, not with dignity, but they went. By mid-morning, every soul in Redrock Flats had heard a version of the story. The versions varied. In some, Raines had drawn faster than lightning. In others, he had fought all four men simultaneously. None of it was accurate. All of it carried the same essential truth. Someone had faced Silas Drummond's enforcers and walked away clean, upright, and unhurried, and that had not happened in Redrock Flats in longer than most people could remember. The effect was a peculiar electricity in the air, the feeling of a room where someone has finally said aloud what everyone has been thinking in silence for years. Silas Drummond felt it and despised it. He placed the bounty before noon. $50 dead, 75 alive, because Silas wanted to look the man in the eye before he was finished. Word went out to the rough trade that passed through the Silver Spur, the drifters, the failed prospectors, the men who measured their options and consistently found that honest work came last. Two of them accepted without negotiation. Then Silas did something colder. He locked the saloon from the inside, posted a man at the front door and another at the kitchen exit, and sent word to Helma through the barkeep. She was not to leave the building for any reason. She was property of the Silver Spur, and property didn't walk away. She was bait now, dressed up as security, but bait. Raines spent the morning moving through the town quietly, the way he had always worked best, unhurried, observational, asking small questions that pointed toward larger answers. He found the blacksmith at his forge behind the livery. A large, deliberate man named August Pryor, who had lost his land deed to Drummond in a card game later proven crooked. Proven by 3 witnesses, Drummond had subsequently run out of town. August listened to Raines with his hammer resting across his knees, and his eyes, holding the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing what shape it would take. He found the widow, Clara Hess, on her porch with a rifle across her lap that she carried without apology. Her husband had ridden out to confront Drummond over a water rights dispute 8 months ago. His horse had come back. He had not. The sheriff, Drummond's sheriff, had filed it as an accident. He found the circuit preacher, a weathered man called Brother Edmund, camped at the edge of town with a mule and a Bible and no particular hurry to be anywhere. Edmund had witnessed 2 of Drummond's transactions and had been told, politely, that preachers who talked too much had a way of moving on. Raines didn't ask any of them for violence. He asked them for presence. There was a difference, and they all understood it instinctively. At 3 in the afternoon, he slipped a folded note to a kitchen boy who delivered supplies to the saloon's back window. The note contained 11 words: "Be ready at midnight. Bring nothing. You already have everything you need." Inside the saloon, Helma read it twice, committed it to memory, and fed it to the lamp flame without changing her expression. Then she went back to work clearing tables, refilling glasses, absorbing Silas's small cruelties with the stillness of someone who had decided, quietly and completely, that this was the last day she would have to. She spent the hours observing. The guard at the front door rotated every 2 hours, she counted. The man at the kitchen exit left his post briefly at 10 and 11 to refill his coffee. The upstairs windows were unwatched because Sila's assumed fear was enough of a lock. She catalogued all of it and said nothing and waited. Midnight came to Redrock Flats like a held breath. The fire at Hennessy's grain store on the east edge of town started small and announced itself with a sound like crumpling paper before it became something the night sky noticed. It wasn't a dangerous fire. Raines had been precise about that, choosing a structure long abandoned and standing away from anything that mattered. but it was loud enough and bright enough to pull both guards away from the saloon within 90 seconds, drawn by instinct and obligation. Helma was already moving. She came down the back stairs in the dark with her hand trailing the wall, her boots in her other hand so her steps made no sound on the floorboards. She reached the kitchen, crossed it in 8 paces she had already measured in her mind, and pushed through the exit door into the cool night air. She ran 2 steps before a hand appeared from the shadow beside the door. She nearly swung at it. "It's me," Raines said quietly. She exhaled, put her boots on, stood up straight. "The front guard is still at the fire," she said, all business. "We have maybe 4 minutes before Silas notices the kitchen door." 3, he corrected. "He's already noticed." As if in answer, the saloon's front doors crashed open, and Silas Drummond's voice split the night, raw, furious, stripped of every pretense of civility. He came into the street with a lantern and a pistol and 2 bounty men flanking him, and he found Raines and Helma standing in the middle of the main street because Raines had walked them there deliberately. Not running, standing. The bounty men spread to either side. Deputy Greer materialized from the direction of the jail, reconstituted by the promise of restored authority. 6 armed men in total, arranged in a loose crescent, and the street was dark except for the distant orange glow of the fire and the trembling light of Silas's lantern. Silas looked at Helma with the expression of a man regarding an escaped possession. Then he looked at Raines with something closer to genuine hatred, the hatred of a small man for the specific person who has made his smallness visible. "You've made a serious mistake," Silas said. "Most men in your position say that," Raines replied. Then August Pryor stepped out of the shadows to the left, holding his hammer, not raised, just held the way a man holds a truth he has been carrying too long. Clara Hess appeared on the opposite boardwalk with her rifle, the barrel pointed at the ground, her eyes pointed at Silas. Brother Edmund walked to the center of the street and simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, a witness, unmistakable and deliberate, the kind of presence that meant whatever happened next would not happen in darkness. The math in the street changed. Silas looked at his men. He looked at the people of his town, standing against him for the first time in years. Something moved across his face, not conscience, because men like Silas Drummond had spent their conscience long ago. It was the cold recognition of a losing position. He chose wrong anyway. His hand moved toward his pistol. Raines was already moving. The shot was singular and precise. Silas's gun hand, the pistol spinning into the dirt, Silas himself folding to his knees with a cry that was equal parts pain and shock. The bounty men looked at each other and independently reached the conclusion that $75 was not enough. They lowered their weapons. Then they set them on the ground. Raines walked forward slowly. He stopped in front of Silas Drummond, kneeling in the dust of his own street, cradling his hand, diminished completely. "Helma Voss worked for you under a false contract," Raines said clearly for every ear in the street. "You held her by debt that wasn't real. You threatened her, confined her, and used her as leverage tonight." He looked up at the faces watching from doorways and windows, people who had looked down for years. Every person in this town heard that. Every person in this town is a witness. Greer's badge hit the dirt with a small, definitive sound. He walked away without a word, and no one called after him. They rode out as the first gray light of dawn separated the desert from the sky. The town watched from its doorways, not jeering, not cheering. Watching with the quiet expression of people who had just remembered something important about themselves. Helma rode straight in the saddle and did not look back. Raines rode beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The road north opened ahead of them, long and clean and honest in the early light. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, Helma Voss breathed without calculating what the breath might cost her. The desert north of Redrock Flats was a different kind of quiet than the town had been. The town's quiet was the silence of suppression, of words swallowed, of eyes averted, of people making themselves small so that small men could feel large. This quiet was different. It was the quiet of open space, of hawks riding thermals above red rock formations, of wind moving through sage without asking anyone's permission. It was the quiet of a world that had no opinion of you whatsoever, and after years of being crushed beneath the opinion of one man, Helma found it extraordinary. They rode for 2 hours before either of them spoke. Millhaven, Raines said, as though continuing a conversation they hadn't started yet. 2 days north, maybe 3 if the creek crossing is washed out. You've been there before. A few times, honest sheriff, town that works for itself rather than for one man. He paused. It's not perfect, nowhere is, but it's decent, which is rarer than people expect. Helma considered that, and you have someone there, someone who owes you something. He glanced at her sideways. What makes you say that? Because men like you don't make promises they can't keep, she said, and you told me I'd have work. You wouldn't have said it if you weren't certain. He was quiet for a moment. Sheriff Tom Aldridge. I pulled him out of a bad situation in Colorado 4 years back. He's been asking me to come north ever since. And you never did. No, she didn't ask why. She had learned through years of reading rooms, reading faces, reading the particular silences men left behind them like footprints, when a door was closed and when it was simply waiting. This one was waiting, so she left it alone and watched the landscape instead, which was doing something remarkable in the morning light, turning from iron gray to amber to a deep, burning copper that made the whole world look briefly like something precious. They camped the first night beside a shallow creek that moved over smooth stones with a sound like low conversation. Raines built the fire with the efficiency of long practice. Helma cooked what they had: salt pork, hardtack softened in creek water, coffee strong enough to make a reasonable person wince. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who had already been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Eventually, the fire settled into coals, and the stars came out in the particular extravagant abundance that only appears when you are genuinely far from everything, and Helma said, "I was 16 when I signed the contract." Raines didn't respond immediately. He understood this wasn't an invitation for commentary. It was simply something she had decided to put down after carrying it too long. My parents were gone by then. Fever took them both within the same winter. I had no money, no family, no trade. A man came through the orphanage with paperwork. Said it was a work contract, 3 years of service in exchange for room, board, and a wage at the end. She looked at the fire. The wage never came. The 3 years became 11. Every time I tried to leave, Silas found a new debt to attach to my name. Broken glass, unpaid interest, things I'd supposedly borrowed. The numbers always grew faster than I could work. False debt, Raines said quietly. All of it. She was calm saying it, not because it didn't matter, but because she had already decided it would not define the next part of her life, only explain the last part. I knew the contract wasn't legal. But knowing a thing and proving a thing are different, and I had no one to prove it to. Raines stared at the coals. He was quiet for long enough that she looked over at him. My wife and son were in a town called Barrow Creek, he said. I was a marshal. I was away working a case when a land baron named Cutter decided the people of Barrow Creek were an inconvenience to his expansion plans. He stopped, started again. I was 3 days' ride away when it happened. I rode hard. I wasn't fast enough. The fire ticked quietly between them. I spent 2 years after that looking for Cutter, he continued. Found him eventually. Stood him before a judge, a real one, not a bought one. He died in a federal prison in 1871, which was justice, though it didn't feel like much by then. He looked up at the stars. After that, I didn't know what to do with myself, so I moved, town to town, looking for I don't know exactly. Maybe just places where the wrong thing was happening and I still had the capacity to do something about it. Helma looked at him steadily. "Redrock Flats." "Redrock Flats," he agreed. She nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad your horse needed water." Something shifted briefly in his expression, not quite a smile, but the landscape where a smile had been. "So am I," he said. Millhaven was exactly what Raines had said, not perfect, but decent, which turned out to be more than enough. Sheriff Tom Aldridge was a lean, gray-templed man with an honest handshake and the kind of eyes that had seen considerable trouble and chosen, deliberately, not to become it. He met them at the edge of town, shook Raines's hand for a long time without speaking, and tipped his hat to Helma with simple, unperformed respect. "I heard you might be coming," he told Raines. "News travels. Redrock Flats has been a problem for a long time." He glanced at Helma. "I understand you could use a fresh start, ma'am. We have a general store whose owner has been begging for reliable help for 6 months. And the post office position has been empty since February. It requires someone who can read, write, and keep accounts." He said it matter-of-factly, as an offer between equals rather than charity handed downward. "Either one is yours if you want it. Both, if you're ambitious." Helma looked at him steadily. "Both," she said. Aldridge nodded once approvingly and led them into town. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way that only feels miraculous to someone who has been denied ordinary for a very long time. Helma worked at the general store in the mornings, stocking, selling, keeping the ledgers with a precision that astonished the owner, a round, cheerful man named Mr. Fitch who had not had accurate accounts in 3 years. In the afternoons, she worked the post office window, sorting, distributing, writing letters on behalf of those who couldn't write their own, charging nothing extra for the service because she remembered what it meant to need something and have no one offer it freely. She found rooms above a seamstress's shop, clean, quiet, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light. She bought 2 dresses that were hers, not provided by an employer as a form of control. She cooked her own meals, chose her own hours, spent her wages on whatever she decided without accounting to anyone. She slept without waking at every sound. Raines took the deputy position under Aldridge, quiet work, right work, the kind of law enforcement that involved more listening than shooting and more presence than authority. He was good at it with the particular competence of a man whose motivation had nothing to do with power and everything to do with something older and quieter than that. He did not hover near Helma. He did not appoint himself her guardian or treat her restoration as something he owned a share of. He simply existed in the same town, which was enough. 3 months after arriving in Millhaven, on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, when the air had turned the particular clean, cold that smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, Helma was standing in the town square talking with Clara Webb, a schoolteacher who had become her first genuine friend in more years than she could count, when something Clara said made her laugh. Not the polite, careful laugh she had trained herself to produce in the Silver Spur, calculated to avoid drawing too much attention. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded and full, the kind that belongs only to a person who has forgotten, at least in this moment, to be afraid. Across the square, Raines was coming out of the sheriff's office with a sheaf of papers. He heard it. He stopped walking. He looked across the distance at Helma, lit by autumn sun, laughing freely in the middle of an honest town, and he stood there for a moment with something on his face that was not quite expressible in any language that had ever been written down. Then he tipped his hat, turned away, and continued walking. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The letter arrived in November. Written by Brother Edmund and co-signed by August Pryor, it informed them that a territorial judge had ridden into Redrock Flats, reviewed the evidence Edmund had carefully preserved, and removed Silas Drummond from all property and business holdings in the county. Drummond had left town on foot, which was considered by all parties to be appropriate. August Pryor was now heading the town council. The Silver Spur Saloon had been purchased by 3 of its former workers, who were running it honestly and considerably more profitably than before. Helma read the letter at the post office window. She read it twice. Then she filed it in the drawer she kept for important documents, alongside her new work contracts, her room agreement, and the first wage receipt she had ever signed that represented money no one could take from her. That evening she found Raines on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun descend behind the western hills in a long, slow burn of copper and violet. She sat in the adjacent chair. For a while they simply watched the sky do what skies do in that hour, perform their quiet, daily extravagance for anyone willing to stop and receive it. "You didn't have to protect me past that first night," she said finally. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. "No," he said, "but some things once you start you don't stop." She nodded slowly. The sun dropped another degree. The first star appeared, tentative and then certain, above the dark line of the hills. "Good," she said simply. And in the gathering dark of an honest town at the end of an honest day, that was enough for both of them. Two people not defined by their wounds, but by what they had chosen, at considerable cost and with considerable courage, to do after them.